Welcome to The Explainer. So, today we're diving into something I find absolutely fascinating, the psychology of accidental belonging. Have you ever shown up in a new city totally planning to just pass through, only to wake up months or even years later completely rooted there? Well, we're going to unpack exactly how that happens. We're looking at this incredibly evocative piece of writing by Olga Sverchkova. It's the prologue to her Tbilisi Chronicles, and it just brilliantly captures that quiet, almost invisible shift from being a totally detached visitor to, well, a local. Let's get into it. Okay, we're kicking things off with this really simple quote from her text. I came to Tbilisi for a little while. Now, at first glance, that's just a basic travel plan, right? But if you really think about it, it establishes her whole initial mindset. She's detached. It's a clear declaration of temporary status. She was telling this to everyone she met, and honestly, probably most importantly, to herself. Which brings up a really interesting question. Why is just for a little while the single most useful lie a traveler can ever tell? Think about it for a second. When you first drop into a completely foreign place, the sensory overload is real. Everything is unfamiliar, and that can be pretty daunting. So telling yourself, hey, I'm only here temporarily, kind of acts like this emotional armor. It's a psychological shield protecting you from the vulnerability of actually trying to settle into the unknown. Section 1. The short stay illusion. The protective armor of a temporary visitor. So the intention here, when you keep saying, I'm just here for a little while, is to totally avoid making any concrete plans. You don't buy too much stuff, you intentionally don't get attached, you don't pick out a favorite cafe, you don't even bother learning the street names. It's this very clinical, calculated attempt to keep your emotional distance. But then, there's the reality. And the reality is this beautiful, messy human connection that inevitably starts creeping in. You find a bakery you love, or you start exchanging quick greetings with the local shopkeepers, and the tension between that original intention and what's actually happening culminates right here. The author writes, I'll stay a bit, then move on. That's what I believed. This is a massive turning point in the text. You can see the illusion of her brief, unattached visit really starting to crack under the weight of actual lived experience. Section 2. The anatomy of attachment. How little things become everyday life. Now, I want to walk through this sequential progression she lays out, showing how a city slowly dismantles that emotional distance. Step 1. Finding a favorite bakery. It starts out super simple, just a transactional preference for food, right? Step 2. The shopkeeper greets you before you can even greet her. Okay, now it's social recognition. You're becoming a familiar face. Step 3. The dog that waits for you on the street every morning. Suddenly, you're actually part of the local environment's rhythm. And then finally, step 4, the taxi driver. This taxi driver really captures that final stage of attachment. She writes about the taxi driver who insisted he knew the way better than Google Maps. Sometimes he actually did. It's a great little bit of humor for sure, but it also represents a huge shift. When you start surrendering to confident local knowledge instead of blindly following the sterile guidance of your smartphone, that's a huge milestone. It means you're really starting to trust the city and its people. Which leads directly to this profound realization. She says, and somehow without noticing, those little things became my everyday life. I absolutely love that phrasing, without noticing. Because true belonging, at least as we see it in this explainer, isn't some single dramatic movie moment or a conscious choice. It's just the quiet, invisible accumulation of these tiny, everyday interactions. It's the bread, the greetings, the street dog, the local drivers, all of it. Section 3. The anti-guidebook city, the subjective landmarks of Tbilisi. The author makes this point explicitly clear. She says, this isn't a guidebook. You won't find a list of places you simply have to visit. She's actively rejecting that whole traditional guidebook format. And why? Well, as she points out, it's not that famous tourist spots don't exist. It's just that everyone builds their own unique version of a city. The most important places when it comes to actually belonging are deeply personal. They're entirely subjective. Think about the specific subjective landmarks she lists. These aren't giant monuments, they're sensory anchors. An old carved wooden balcony, the smell of fresh bread early in the morning, a quiet courtyard where kids are playing until dusk, a conversation with a complete stranger that wraps up like you've been friends for years. Try to picture the equivalent sensory anchors in your own favorite places. It's these highly specific, honestly kind of mundane details that actually lock us into a location. I want to pause on one of those specific details for just a second to really ground us in the sensory reality of Tbilisi. She mentions shoti bread as this incredibly powerful early morning olfactory anchor. And it's not just about the food itself. The smell of it baking is literally woven into the fabric of the morning routine she accidentally adopted. It comes to represent the authentic, daily rhythm of the whole city. And that transitions perfectly into this next thought. I'm not trying to explain Tbilisi. Honestly, I'm not even sure that's possible. There's just this beautiful humility there, isn't there? It fully acknowledges that the real magic of certain places completely defies logical explanation. You can't map it, you just can't put the feeling of a quiet courtyard or the smell of warm bread into a neat step-by-step travel itinerary. Section 4. When places become home. The quiet moment of transformation. To really understand this transformation, we need to revisit her opening notes. She writes, "Any resemblance to real people is purely coincidental. Any resemblance to Tbilisi is inevitable." The dynamic at play here is super fascinating. Individual people might come and go or kind of blur together in her memory, but the city itself, the city is the unavoidable, absolutely undeniable main character of her newly established life. So let's break down the core goal of her Tbilisi Chronicles. The purpose here is really threefold. It's to tell about a city, it's to tell about its people, and, perhaps most importantly, it's to describe the quiet moment a foreign place suddenly becomes home. That quiet moment is exactly the transition we've been tracking this whole time. That exact second, the protective armor just falls away completely. And that brings the whole narrative beautifully full circle. She writes, "Because that's how it always begins. I'm only here for a little while." It's so ironic, right? The very phrase we use to prevent getting attached is actually the required prerequisite for it. By lying to ourselves, saying we're only visiting, we lower our guard just enough for the bakery, the street dog, and the taxi driver to slip in. That self-protective lie is, paradoxically, the very first step toward finding a true home. Which leaves us with this final thought. Based on everything we've just explored about the psychology of accidental belonging, I want to turn the question directly over to you. What was the place you visited just for a little while that unexpectedly became your home? Think about your own subjective landmarks and your own quiet moments of transformation. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it gives you a whole new way to think about the places we travel to and the places we eventually stay.